Good day, and welcome to another Answers Weekly Wraps. As usual, we'll cover three stories from the last week or so that affect you and your investments going forward. And we could end up with a little extra on wrap about what's happening with AI this week. So, three stories are going to be the US banking crisis, some indicators of the global luxury markets, and finally end up with a look at a developing story around badly South African sales of armaments to the Russians. Okay, the US banking crisis is not ending. A couple of weeks ago, Jerome Powell, head of the US Fed, talked about a line that won't be crossed. We talked about First Republic Bank, trying to indicate that that was going to be the end of the problems. The next bank on the chopping block, it appears to be, is a bank called Pacific Western, PacWest. And this bank basically, in the last week or so, rallied up quite nicely. It's still down, 70-something% or 60-something% from, where it was a few months ago. But, the last week, there was a bit of a rally on this positivity. Unfortunately, in the last day or so, we've seen a double-digit, 20-something% drop on Thursday with regards to this particular bank, showing that there's still a lot of uncertainty. You don't drop the price of a bank 20% in a day or 22% in a day unless there's uncertainty about the banking sector. The US Fed seems to be losing control of the narrative here. They are continually saying that they are about to end this thing, there'll be no contagion, and yet more and more banks every week seem to be going under. Or at least the trail of banks or the steady stream of banks going under doesn't seem to be stopping. It's quite likely that we're going to have another one of these rescues occurring. From what I gather, that even without the bank, individual bank issues, the flows of funds into the big four banks, which are protected by the Federal Reserve and the US government in terms of being too big to fail, that money continues to go, unabated. Something needs to be done about this. Maybe the Fed has to come out and say, for instance, we're increasing the guarantee up to maybe $5 or $10 million for the deposit guarantee. That might stop the flow of all but the largest, clients to the bigger banks. But short of something like that there, or maybe even could, fix it entirely by saying, okay, it's a total guarantee. But, short of that there, I don't see why an individual or a company with some sizable amounts of assets would ever want to invest or put their deposits with a smaller bank. And right now, as investors, basically, if you have equity in these banks, if your bank does go down, the Federal Reserve wants to punish you as a bondholder, equity holder. So, anyone that buys these bonds or equity from a smaller bank is taking quite a bit of risk at the moment, I would believe. So, yeah, the banking sector in the US, still the problem continues. Yet another bank seems to be on the precipice at the moment. And something needs to be done to stop this. There needs to be a savior or some kind of measure put in place to save these banks. And it may require drastic action, like I said, increasing dramatically the insurance or the insured amount, or possibly insuring everything, quite frankly. The next thing is some luxury good news. We saw results from Richmond, which seems to indicate that the luxury demand out of China is quite high. Why is this an important factor? Well, if you look at Europe, for instance, a lot of their big companies are luxury goods, and that's also important. Richmond obviously has a relationship with South Africa, and that's giving us a bit of an uptick. But I think if you're seeing luxury good demand out of China being strong, it's quite likely that some of the fears about the economic crisis, about the recovery after COVID, etc., may be overblown. Okay, you can always extrapolate luxury good demand because that's usually the very, very upper top of the economy. In fact, it is. And sometimes you have more widespread issues in the economy that sometimes the total upper crust can ignore. But I think generally, if you had to look at China, you can trust these European companies selling luxury goods into China, but more than sometimes you can trust from the government statistics in terms of how the country is doing. And if you are seeing, for instance, strong luxury good demand coming out, I think it's a reasonable indicator that the Chinese economy looks a little better than I think people had feared, which is obviously good news not just for China but for us in Africa as well, because China has a huge demand, or it's a huge source of demand for raw materials. And if we are seeing the Chinese economy recovering after COVID, we're probably going to be seeing more demand coming through. Speaking of raw materials, it's been a very volatile time for oil and etc. We saw Brent crude hit about $70 a barrel. This is, I think, something that if the Chinese economy is doing reasonably well, is not something that's going to last, because they're a big demand of oil. They're a big, source of growth in oil demand over the last few years. At the same time as well, I mean, around oil, we've seen some stuff around China and India, where the Russia and India, where the Russians aren't happy accepting the Indian currency anymore for their oil because they have too many billions of rupees apparently to spend, and they don't really want it. They prefer yuan, but at least they can buy some stuff from China. There's not much India just can sell to Russia. Chinese can sell a lot more to Russia. So that's one interesting factor on that. And speaking of Russia, that's our big story of the week. Apparently, according to the US ambassador to South Africa, we have been selling some armaments to the Russians. Why is this important? Because this breaks a number of international treaties, and we are not Russia, sorry, not China, we're not India, we're not one of these big countries. We don't have the ability to stand up to the Americans. I mean, even the Russians and even the Chinese and the Indians don't have a total ability to stand up to the Americans, but we definitely don't. If we have gone out and sold armaments to the Russians, it is one of the most foolish moves we could be making. Okay, forget about the morality of the Russia-Ukraine war, etc. Right now, I think almost everybody, even the biggest fans of Russia, are going to agree that the Russians have not done as well as they'd hoped. They definitely are worse off right now than they were, a year and a half ago. That's just a fact. With sanctions, with the economic, slowdown that they experienced because of that, etc., they are worse off right now than they were a year and a half before. The Europeans and the Americans, not that much. I mean, the Europeans, you can talk about the fact that energy prices are higher and they might be affected, but the Americans basically don't care about this stuff. It's a propaganda thing. They're willing to spend a few tens of billions of dollars every few months to send stuff to the Ukrainians. But given the size of the American economy, given the amount of money that they have, the amount of armaments, the power, and so on, this is nothing but a sideshow to the Americans. The Americans have basically weathered this whole Ukraine-Russia war without too much of an impact, and the Russians are quite badly hurt. It's obvious who's the winner relatively. It's the Americans are winning versus the Russians in this particular environment. And yet we in South Africa have chosen to sell stuff to the losers and kind of snub the winners. Why? It does not make sense for us to do that. But yet that has happened. And why is this important? Well, quite frankly, the Americans have pretty much co-opted the international financial systems as we know it in South Africa. Things that are the foundations of the system, like for instance SWIFT, which is what you're allowed to do, what you use for basically doing interbank transfers and so on. That stuff is basically controlled by the Americans and the Europeans. A lot of the stuff that we do business with, a lot of companies we do business with in South Africa, when we do invest overseas, when we want to do international transactions, our financial services, etc., they are basically European and American companies that we primarily deal with. If they're not, if they're somewhere in Australia or if they're somewhere, for instance, in, say, the Bahamas or something, guess what? Those are all kind of satellites to the American-European system, So if we are basically annoying the Americans and therefore also incurring the wrath of the Europeans, etc., it's really, really silly because we are so vulnerable to some kind of pushback from them. I can imagine a number of things they could do that would really, really badly affect us and have almost no impact on their economies, on their profitability, etc. In fact, it would basically help them going forward because it shows that they have the ability to go and punish a country like in the African continent. We may be a small player in the world, but we are a big player in the African continent. We are a big player in developing markets. And if we get smacked down badly, and they can show us as an example of what will happen to you if you mess around with Russia, well, it'll cost them almost nothing from their point of view to do it, and it will cost us quite a bit on our side. And that is something I think that we in South Africa have to take into account, that the government right now is really playing a dangerous game. And it could, in a way, basically hunt down and hurt you as an individual investor quite badly. If the government continues to antagonize the US, maybe they've already done that too much already, we could easily be facing some serious pushback from the Americans and Europeans, and that would translate into the inability of South Africans to basically access international markets for investment or travel or whatever it may be. And that, I think, is something that you've got to take into account when you're planning your portfolio. Yes, another rand is weakening dramatically. And by the way, I'll mention that we're going to mention that as well. The rand went to 1930. Before this thing was announced, it was 1860, 1870. The fact that we may have sold arms to the Americans, that indicates that basically the currency is weakening because there's a belief that we might be facing some kind of repercussions, and being cut off or reducing our access to the Western financial system is going to have a huge impact in terms of how our financial markets operate. And so the rand being at 1930, that's one thing. But here's the thing: is that the rand should be at 1870, should be at 18 maybe, or even like 1750, depending on how you value these things. But if the Americans come out and smack us with some really hard kind of countermeasures, we'll blow past 20, no problem. So this is something to think about. It's the fact that we are in a situation right now where we are playing with, in a very big game, one of the big boys game, and we are minor pawns in here, and the kind of blowback we can be receiving is quite negative. And the blowback is generally going to come from the US and Europe, and that's pretty much where you want to be putting your money if you want to invest. So maybe it might be an idea to try and push some stuff out before something really bad happens. So of course, like I said, the rand is very, very weak right now, but I'm more fearful of the rand blowing out than basically coming back to about 17 or 16. Okay. And then finally is a little AI wrap. I'll put two stories out there for you. One is Google's I/O Day, which is basically how Google goes out and announces all these new developments. And they talked about things like the 7A Pixel, which is their phone, a number of other factors. But one interesting thing that I want to point out is that they've come out with, this Google system is called Bard. And they put Bard out to 180 countries. There's no more wait list. You can just access Bard in 180 countries in English. And why is this important? Because I mentioned this a few weeks ago. I think that when you have an AI system like a Bard or a ChatGPT operating with hundreds of millions of people, the training it gets versus what it would have gotten initially by just scrolling text on the internet, that difference is kind of like putting a child in front of a television versus putting a child with a teacher. A child in front of the television learns something, it absorbs the information, but there's no feedback. You put somebody in front of a teacher, there's feedback, there's talk. You got that wrong. This is why you got that wrong. And that's what we're going to be doing when Bard is accessible. There'll be feedback to Bard. People will be saying, yes or no to certain things. This is a vastly important thing. Remember, the way the AI system works right now is called reinforcement learning with human feedback. Previous to this, the human feedback came from people being paid $1 or $2 an hour in like the Philippines and so on to basically go off and train your AI. What's happened right now is that with ChatGPT 4 out there in the market with 100+ million people looking at it, those 100+ million people are doing the same job that we were paying somebody $2 an hour to do in the Philippines before. Not quite as exact, but pretty much the same job, which is give human feedback to the output of the program. Think about that. Yes, we are getting this wonderful service for free, and some people even pay for it, and I don't think paying for it is a bad idea. I'll talk about that again in a second. But what they were paying somebody $2 an hour before to do for them, now they're getting done for free. People are actually paying them for the privilege to do this work for them, of giving human feedback to the output of the computer. And when Bard rolls out, it's going to be the same thing. Yes, I know ChatGPT 4 was doing a lot of stuff, but Bard is going to do the same stuff for you. It's going to integrate into Help Me Write with Gmail, which I'm talking about in a second as well. It's going to be a lot of people using Google and giving feedback, saying, I don't like this, I like that result. That result was good, this result was bad. And this machine is going to learn from that. Okay, and that is going to be something that's going to really jumpstart what's happening with these machines. And I mentioned the fact that it's going to integrate into Gmail with something called Help Me Write. Basically, what you can do now is you can basically put a reply to an email, okay? Type in the kind of response you want to put in. So for instance, the example that Google used was somebody had wanted to cancel or had a flight cancel, and they offered him like $75 for the cancellation. And he says, I want a full refund. All you do is reply to the individual email and in say, Help Me Write, you say, I want a full refund. I don't want the $75. And you'll write the email that says that, referring to the flight information in the email that you're replying to. So let's just say it says, in flight this thing here, I was offered $75. I don't want $75. I want the full refund. Obviously, it's said in much better ways than I just said it right now. Proper business format, proper punctuation, etc. But that's what it's doing. And once you look at the number of people that have a Gmail account, which is pretty much everybody nowadays, that's a huge inbuilt database that's going to be giving feedback to Google, because Google's going to not just see you sending the email, it's going to see what the actual email is. Think about that. You're going to see Help Me Write. Google's going to get the email that you basically sent out in the end, and it's going to compare the two and see where the differences are. And by doing that, they're going to know what they got right and what they got wrong. Like I said, this is actually better, because what you're paying the guy $2 an hour for was saying up or down for, thumbs up, thumbs down for, a response. This response is I like it, this response I don't like it. Yeah, Google's going to get the initial output of the thing and going to get also, because it's cheap, the email you sent them. It'll be able to compare that and have a very good idea as to what the thing is getting right or wrong. And the thing I want to add on to this is that multimodality is coming about. Right now, okay, ChatGPT and all these programs basically are working off a single modality, which is text. They get text in, they put text out. Multimodality is you have text, you have video, you have images, or just text and images, and then maybe add video later. But there's more than one modality. The thing is that not only is the output more interesting, which is obviously what we are concerned about usually, but also, more importantly, the data set that you can access is vastly larger. If you only look at text, you only got text to look at. You only look at video, you only got video, or look at pictures, you only got pictures. But when you add text, video, and pictures together, you have a much, much larger database. And the bigger the database you train these things on, the better they become. And if you can train them on, video and images and text, because it's such a big database, there's more basically examples out there, and there's more things this thing will be able to learn from, and therefore there'll be more things you can do down the line. And already, some of the stuff that's been running, even with just text, has been magical. For instance, the fact of the matter is that you can write in GPT-4, use this graphical program to draw me a picture of a unicorn, and it will draw something that kind of looks like a unicorn, with like kind of legs, like a body, a head, and a little horn. Not exactly like as good as a Dali, by no means. But how did they figure out that's what a unicorn is by just looking at text? Somehow there's an understanding that happens to that. But now it won't have to look at just the text, it'll have the images, it'll have the video, and you can imagine how much better these things can be. And the final thing I want to talk about is Microsoft. You all know Microsoft basically has kind of gotten the early advantage because of ChatGPT and OpenAI has. Microsoft has come out and said that it's going to freeze the salaries of all full-time workers. Hourly workers will get paid, but if you're a salaried worker, full-time salaried worker, you're going to have a salary freeze, and it's going to redivert these resources towards AI. Understand that the stuff that's happened so far, some of the big language models, like for instance GPT-4, took about $100 million worth of actual, training time to work on, not just the capital requirements to build it up, but the actual time it took to run that basically was $100 million worth of time for the machines. Now, if they're freezing salaries in order to fund more research into AI, even though 100 million sounds like a lot, it's nothing compared to what they can be doing. And I think that's something we're going to be expecting going forward. The amount of money flowing into AI, massively larger than before. And with the new developments, like we're talking about with multimodality and so on, there's no sign that this stuff is slowing down at the moment. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks for joining me. And I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week, where I'm sure we'll have more interesting things about South Africa and AI. And of course, all the other stuff we talked about today. Cheers.